The silverware clinked. Glasses shimmered beneath golden light. Laughter floated from nearby tables, but at table 9, silence held court. A white waitress stood trembling with rage, her fingers stabbing the air like a gavel. "You people can't just walk in here expecting to be served," she snapped, voice echoing across the dining room. Across from her sat a black couple, elegant, composed, unshaken. The man's fist curled slowly on the linen tablecloth, not in anger, but restraint. The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes unreadable, her voice absent, but her presence louder than the scream in front of her. Guests turned. Phones rose. The tension was no longer between 3 people. It was a room divided between assumption and truth. She thought they didn't belong. She had no idea they were the reason she had a job. Tell us where you're watching from, because this one flips the script hard. Julian and Camille Brooks were not the kind of billionaires who needed to be seen. Their empire, Brooks International, spanned continents, with luxury hotels, 5-star restaurants, and a philanthropic arm that had quietly rewritten the rules of hospitality. But on this particular afternoon, there were no entourages, no press, no private chefs. Just the 2 of them, dressed simply, seated at a white linen table in the corner of one of their latest acquisitions, a French-Italian fusion restaurant tucked into the heart of the city. Camille wore a pearl-toned satin blouse that caught the light like still water. Julian's navy blazer sat sharp against the tailored lines of his shoulders. They looked like any other elegant couple out for a quiet lunch, but they weren't. They were here on purpose, undercover, observing. The restaurant was pristine, marble floors, moody teal walls, golden sconces casting soft halos of warmth. It exuded wealth, but beneath the polish something colder lingered, the kind of chill that came not from air vents, but from glances. The staff moved efficiently, speaking in rehearsed tones of politeness. Except Sarah. Sarah was the waitress assigned to their table. Blonde, composed, and immaculately dressed, she moved with the kind of precision born from both training and assumption. She smiled, but not at them. She spoke, but not to them. Her tone, when taking their order, dripped with false warmth, her eyes darting too quickly past Camille, too sharply at Julian's watch, as if evaluating what they could afford. She asked twice if they were waiting on someone. When Camille requested the wine list, Sarah offered her water instead, with a smile. Camille didn't flinch. Julian said nothing. This wasn't the first time they'd been mistaken for guests instead of owners. But that was the point. This visit wasn't about flavor. It was about truth. They'd acquired the restaurant chain a month ago, with plans to quietly rebrand it. New management, new culture, new face. But before that, they wanted to know what was still rotting beneath the polish. And now they knew. The first sign came softly, almost forgivably. Sarah placed menus at every table in her section except theirs. Camille had to ask for one. Sarah smiled stiffly and replied, "Of course. I thought you might just be waiting on someone." She didn't bring the wine list. When Camille requested it again, Sarah responded, "We don't normally hand that out unless you're dining from the full menu." Across the room, a couple at a nearby table was already swirling Pinot Noir, laughing under the warm hush of low music. Camille's posture didn't change. She sat with her back straight, one hand resting gently on her lap, her expression calm, but every detail etched itself into her memory like chalk on black stone. Julian remained still, his gaze moving, not with suspicion, but with analysis. He'd seen Sarah before, in boardrooms disguised as assistants, in networking events misnaming his position. She wasn't a villain. She was a symptom, trained in Polish, not equity. The next blow came quiet but sharp. When Camille asked if the special on the board included any dairy, "I'm mildly allergic," she said. Sarah barely glanced up. "If you have dietary needs, you should have mentioned it earlier. We're busy tonight." There was no crowd. Half the tables were empty. Camille set her silverware down gently. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Her tone turned colder. "Is there a problem?" Julian's voice came low and steady. "Just a request." But Sarah leaned in, and the mask dropped. Her voice rose, not in volume but in edge. "Look, people like you can't just walk in here and expect service like everyone else. This is a fine establishment." The words floated like acid across the room. The clinking stopped. Conversations hushed. Guests turned in their chairs. A man 2 tables down reached for his phone. A woman began recording. Julian didn't move. Camille tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in something between pity and patience. Then, almost too softly for anyone but her husband to hear, she leaned toward him and whispered, "Should we tell her?" Julian's reply came without a blink. "Not yet." The air in the restaurant turned sharp, like glass stretched thin. Sarah, flustered and red-faced, looked around the room as though searching for someone to back her up. Her voice rang louder than necessary. "If you won't leave quietly, I'll have to call security." She didn't wait for a response. Her heels clicked furiously as she marched toward the host stand and returned moments later, accompanied by a tall security guard in a black blazer. The guard glanced at Julian and Camille, unsure, his professionalism flickering in the face of so many watching eyes and recording phones. Camille didn't flinch. Instead, she rose with the kind of grace that made silence feel deliberate. She didn't shout. She didn't explain. She simply reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone, sliding it across the white tablecloth like a chess piece. The screen lit up with a press release, published just that morning. Bold headline, branded logo, a single, undeniable line. Brooks International acquires White Orchid Hospitality Group. Gasps moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. The security guard leaned down to read, then immediately stepped back, murmuring, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I didn't—" But Sarah didn't move. Her mouth parted slightly, her words lost. The color drained from her face as she stared at the screen in disbelief. Julian sat still, hands folded, posture unshaken. Camille slowly returned to her seat, her every motion deliberate. She poured herself a glass of water, her fingers steady. Julian finally spoke, his voice low, calm, but carrying the weight of every silent injustice they'd endured before this one. "So, should we discuss staff restructuring over dessert?" The sentence landed like thunder beneath a velvet curtain. No raised voices, no retaliation, just power, spoken softly enough to silence an entire room. The flash of a camera flickered from the corner. Someone whispered, "That's them. That's them." Sarah stumbled backward, her face blank. The confidence she once wore like perfume had vanished, replaced by something raw. Exposure. Camille took a slow sip of water. She didn't look at Sarah. She didn't need to. The moment had already said everything. The double doors near the kitchen burst open, and the general manager rushed out, red in the face and breathing hard. His eyes scanned the scene. Guests frozen mid-bite. Cameras raised. Sarah pale and speechless. And at the center of it all, Julian and Camille Brooks, sitting as if the room itself now turned around them. The GM's face changed the moment he saw them. Recognition swept over him like a wave. "Mr. Brooks." "Mrs. Brooks," he stammered, approaching quickly. "I am so sorry. I wasn't informed you'd be visiting today." Julian nodded once, but it was Camille who stood, her voice calm but precise. "We didn't come for the attention. We came to see how guests are treated when no one's watching. And now we know." The GM blushed with embarrassment, throwing a furious glance at Sarah, who was shrinking behind the host stand. "She didn't know. She didn't need to know our name," Camille said, her tone still quiet. "Just our right to be here." Sarah stepped forward then, barely holding herself together. Her voice trembled. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend." Julian turned toward her, eyes steady. "We don't need your apology," he said plainly. "We needed your respect yesterday." The words hung in the air, not cruel, not loud, but final. Sarah's eyes filled with the kind of realization that came too late. Her assumptions, once worn like armor, now looked like cracks she could no longer patch. Camille didn't speak to her, didn't glance. She simply picked up her clutch and walked forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As she passed Sarah, she said nothing, and that silence, measured, deliberate, spoke more powerfully than any reprimand ever could. The staff, lined along the kitchen corridor, stood straighter. One of the younger servers bowed her head slightly as Camille passed. Another followed suit. Within seconds, the entire staff stood still, a quiet acknowledgement of presence and truth. Not out of fear, out of respect. Julian joined Camille at the door. Together, without raising their voices, they exited a room forever changed. By morning, the video had traveled farther than any plate ever served in that restaurant. Snippets of Sarah's outburst, followed by Camille's quiet composure and Julian's single, unshakable line, "We needed your respect yesterday," were stitched into a dozen viral edits, subtitled in languages the Brookses didn't even speak. The comments poured in by the thousands. Some were outraged, many were moved. But the ones that mattered most came from people who had lived through something similar. "Thank you for standing tall without shouting." This is what dignity looks like. They didn't clap back. They stood still and let the world turn. A week later, Camille returned to that same restaurant, not as a guest, but as a leader. The dining room was quieter, the tension gone. The staff waited inside the kitchen, their postures nervous but open. Sarah wasn't among them. She had submitted a resignation the day after the incident went public. Camille didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The restaurant was already different. New faces, softer eyes, people who had heard the story and decided they didn't want to be part of the next one. Standing beneath the warm glow of the pendant lights, Camille addressed the team not with bitterness, but with clarity. She didn't bring up race directly. She didn't list statistics. She simply told them a story. Her story. Of being turned away from tables she paid to build. Of walking into rooms only to be asked to leave. Of how, in a world quick to shout, she had learned the deeper strength of standing still. "I've learned," she said gently, "that dignity doesn't rush to defend itself. It waits for truth to catch up." The room was silent, but it wasn't the same kind of silence that followed Sarah's words that day. This was reverence. Later that month, Brooks International quietly issued a new staff training manual to all White Orchid hospitality locations. On the first page, there was a photo of Camille from that day. Calm, elegant, standing in silence, at the center of a restaurant that had tried to misplace her. Below it, a single caption: "Dignity served daily." Julian, watching from the office window above, leaned back in his chair and smiled softly to himself. When an assistant asked what drove them to keep expanding the empire, He responded with something few would expect from a hospitality mogul. "We built this empire to feed people, not just food, but truth. And sometimes that's all they really need." Weeks later, Julian and Camille Brooks returned, not in disguise, not to observe, but as honored guests. The air inside the restaurant felt lighter, more honest. Staff moved with warmth, not stiffness. Smiles reached eyes. The energy had shifted, not just because the owners were present, but because the lesson had settled deep. At table 9, the one where everything began, fresh flowers stood in a crystal vase. Camille ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the linen napkin before taking a small, thoughtful bite of her risotto. She smiled, not for the flavor, but for the moment, for what had changed, for what had endured. Julian raised his glass, and for a quiet second, they let the peace speak. Some people taste power, others serve it. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? If this story left a mark, share it. Because class doesn't shout. It walks in, sits down, and owns the table. Thanks for watching. And remember, dignity always gets the last word.